So once again, I greet you with our revolutionary greetings from the African Continental Unity Party, ACUP, as well as from the Free-Minded Pan-African Academy, the School of African Leaders. My name is King Kabbalah. I am a revolutionary Pan-Africanist because I believe in Africa and I believe in African people. I believe that we have the capacity to recreate ourselves out of the conditions in which we find ourselves today, of course, resulting from colonialism and neocolonialism. We are more than capable of changing our situation and recreate ourselves in a way that can reposition us as a people with dignity, people with respect in the world. And I think what we are doing here is part of that process of recreating Africa. So, as you know, that we are on a journey, a revolutionary journey, and this revolution is more scientific revolution. Scientific means simply it based on knowledge, seeking knowledge at every crossroad. We seek new knowledge, we examine what we have done in the past, and we find new ways to do things better in order to succeed. Because, mind you, every day the enemy works, the enemy plans, the enemy makes these projects in order to counteract our progress. So it is our duty to question ourselves, to study, to reassess what we have used as a strategies in the past. So today we are going to do that exercise in relation to our culture as African people. We want to question the African culture. We want to examine the culture to see if it is really a hindrance today or it is actually helping us to achieve the liberation that we want. As you can see from the title of this lecture, which is Culture on Trial. We are not aiming to condemn the culture, but we just want to question it. So I think the aim out of this lecture is for each one of us to assess our lives and our identity as African people, and eventually to take actions according to the recommendations that will be done and according to what we feel is okay to do for the better of Africa. So we introduce, when we say mostly that, when we mention the word culture, or when the word culture is mentioned, in most cases, what comes to our mind is the attire, the clothing, the language, the names, all these things, the food, dance, and the music, all those things that we mostly refer to when we talk about culture. But culture go deeper than that, than just these symbols. Whether you talk about language, all these are the symbols, but the notion of culture, it goes deeper than those symbols, right? Because culture actually relates to the everyday habits, institutions, knowledge systems, and practices that shape how people think, learn, organize, and survive, right? In other words, culture is that which equips us to build tools that will allow us to survive, to flourish, and to grow, to achieve whatever objectives that we have in mind. So, in this lecture, I will argue that one vital dimension of culture related to the African culture, right, which is its capacity to enable us as a people to free ourselves from today's neocolonialism and take charge of our lives and our destiny. That aspect of our culture is actually not practiced, sometimes discussed, but not really practiced, right? And by examining where our cultures empower us or where they hold us back, we can begin to innovate traditions so they become engines of liberation rather than ornaments of identity. So we begin maybe by just briefly defining culture. And of course, every lot of people in the world, a lot of scholars have used different definitions to define what culture is. Well, no matter what you want to consider, for the purpose of this lecture, I want to consider a definition that was given by the author Walter Rodney in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. He defined culture as the interaction of people with the environment. So, the interaction of the people with the environment, that is culture, according to Walter Rodney. Because, of course, we know that from the environment, we take whatever we want, the food that we want, we go to the environment. If we want to find our partner in this world, we go to the environment. When we want clothes, shelter, all the things that we want, we rely on the environment. And when we talk about the environment in this context, it is not just the physical land, it is also the social environment, it is the economic environment, it is also the political environment. So the holistic environment is what we are talking about, right? So it's the interaction of the people with the environment that produces actually the culture. So when we talk about nation, every nation on earth is composed actually with the two basic elements, which are the people and the environment. When they talk about the Chinese, the Americans, Africans, you cannot talk about a nation if there's no people and the environment. If you have just the land and you don't have people, you don't have nation. So it is culture is actually the way that the people organize themselves to interact with their environment so that they can feed themselves, so that they can shelter themselves, so that they can grow, they can develop, they can become whatever they want to become in this world. So basically, culture is that particular organization that people decided to organize themselves in order to interact with their environment. So each nation on earth, whether you talk about the Americans, the Africans, each nation has evolved over time in a unique way or with a unique way of interaction with its environment. The way that Chinese have evolved to interact with the environment is not exactly the way that us as African people have evolved to interact with our environment. I'll give you an example. We all experience hunger, all of us as human beings, but what people eat in China and the way they eat it and how they cook it is different from what people eat in Africa and the way they cook it and the way and how they cook it and how they eat, right? And this difference comes actually from how people have evolved to begin interacting with the environment. So each people have a particular way, right, of interacting with the environment. In other words, they have a particular culture. And at the bottom of that culture, you will find a relationship between the people and the environment. And I said environment can be social environment, economic environment, political, so forth and so on. Now, when we examine, for example, the African culture, we find that the way that our ancestors organize themselves to interact with the environment is framed in the common word that we call Ubuntu. We all know that. Ubuntu is the core of African culture, which means is the code that, or is the way that our ancestors codified the interaction between them and the environment. That word, I mean, that core or that basic foundational culture of foundation element of African culture is what we call Ubuntu, which mostly we say it is I am because you are. So that simply means I am because you are. It means that my growth, my success depends on you, as well as your success depends on me. So it means at the bottom of Ubuntu, which is the African culture, from whatever you look at it, you will find some few elements which are interdependency, cooperation, mutual support, briefly, communal strength and interdependence. These are the things that form the foundation of African culture. If you try, for example, to compare African culture with, for example, European culture, you will see that European culture is mostly the core of European culture is individualism and competition. While on this side of Africa, the core of our culture is collective strength, cooperation, and mutual support, right? Which means for me to rise, I need to find my strength in my family, in my community, and in my society, right? My success depends on what my community, my family, and my society can put on the table for me, right? While in Europe, my success depends on how I am capable to exploit other people, how I am capable to enslave other people, to take whatever they have to make it mine so that I can grow, so that I, as an individual, I can grow, I can develop. So these are the fundamental elements that we find within cultures when you talk about the African culture in comparison to, for example, Western culture. So the point is this: does this aspect of Ubuntu, which I have just explained, interdependence, collaboration, cooperation, right, mutual strength and support, which is at the foundation of African culture, does this really, is this really a reality of every African person in the world today? Or in other words, does it equip us today for the liberation that we are struggling for? This is the important question. Then that leads us to what we call then the trial, which is the foundation of today's lecture. So in this part, we are just going to examine how Ubuntu as the African culture interacts with us in everyday's life. As we said from the beginning, that culture is everyday's practice, habits, institutions, knowledge systems, all these things that we do that sustain our life, right? That make us grow. These are part of the culture. It's not just the clothes, the language, all these things, but it's the practice of every day. So the question actually is, when you look at your life today, I mean, this is a question that I'm putting out there for every one of us. When you look at your life, whatever that you have achieved in the world today, in your life, can you really relate that to your community, starting from your family, your community, and your society? Can you say that you have succeeded because of your family, because of your community, because of your society? Can you say that without your community, you wouldn't have achieved whatever business that you are doing, whatever education that you have gone through, whatever success that you have in life today? Is it because of your community? Is it because of Ubuntu or is it because of something else? Because when I look in Africa today, one thing that I know, the reality of everyday life for any African that I know, most of Africans that I know, is that our survival is tied to foreign products and systems. In other words, you wake up in the morning, you want to check news, for example, you run to a phone, which is a product of other culture, not Ubuntu as a culture. You jump on the road, whether in your car or on public transport, to go to your work. The car is made by another culture, not African culture. You get to the workplace. In most cases, it is an institution which is produced by the culture of other people, which means your boss is a European, your company is not even an African company. All the institutions that we rely on for our survival, whether it's the institution of food production, medicine, education, all these institutions are the product of other culture. So the question is, where does Ubuntu, where does African culture, which is based on mutual success, which is based on my success, depends on my community, my family, my society, where does it apply in our everyday's life? And remember, Chinua Achebe, a Nigerian scholar, said that every product manufactured by men is an ambassador of the culture that produced it. So products, whether it's the phone, whether it's the clothes, whether it's I don't know, any item that you have in your house, It is not just a passive item that you have in your house. And that's the reason why, actually, at the back of every item, you will see that made somewhere. That is not done without a purpose. It is because that products represent the culture that produced it. So, what sustains our life every day is the products that we have produced, the tools or products of our culture as Ubuntu, or is just the products done by other people. And in most cases, because we all, right, navigating with these products and institutions that are products of other culture, in other words, it makes us ambassadors of other culture than of our own culture. The phones, the clothes, the way that we eat, everything that we do, we are just ambassadors of cultures that produced all those things, not of our own culture, right? So we are ambassadors of those cultures, unfortunately. And because of that, because of our heavy reliance, right, of, of those cultures and their products, we are living every day as Europeans, or I should say, as little Europeans or little Americans. And we have only one day, which I hate, which is called the African Day, where then we have a chance to wear our clothes as African clothes, do all the symbolic things or do celebrations one day, African Day. But the rest of the days throughout the year, we are what? Africans, or we are Europeans, because we are given one day to celebrate, which is African Day. So the rest of the days, it means we are just little Europeans, little Americans, or little French, all the days. So where is Ubuntu? That's the question. And actually, it becomes even worse for many of us. The, the contradiction begins in our family. Most of us, we don't even get support from our families. The first people who resist your development, your success, is your immediate family and immediate community. You come up with an idea, it is your family that oppose that idea or that fight against that idea because of jealousy. You come up with something good that can change the condition of many people in the society. It is your community that resists you, that will not support you. So the question that I'm asking, what is the impact or the usefulness of African culture in our daily lives if we have to rely on other cultures to survive, to eat, to study, to grow, to evolve, to develop, and then call ourselves Africans? This is the question that we need to ask about the essence of African culture, or Ubuntu. So, because of our heavy reliance on others' culture, we are living in humiliation as African people. We are living in a state of inferiority and weakness towards other people whose culture sustains our lives. So we can make speech all over the world. We can have all these gurus in Africa who get offered a lot of money to go into conferences and talk about African culture and Ubuntu. We know all these people, wearing African clothes, letting their beards grow, so forth and so on. But the point is that really what is transforming or sustaining our daily life? You can tell African kids to love Africa. That's okay. But how can we tell them to love Africa if it's Europe that feeds them? If it's Europe that gives them job? If it's Europe that clothes them? It is a contradiction. It's a contradiction. That's why you see that today's generations, and mostly if we don't do something, the next generation will be a generation of people who are disloyal to the continent simply because we can tell them how beautiful our culture is. But the question is, who feed them? What culture feeds them? What culture gives them the job? What culture gives them a shelter? What culture gives them the education? And if we are not able to resolve that question or those questions, we are going to hand over to our children humiliation, inferiority, weakness, which will not allow Africa to grow, to develop, and to achieve its objectives. Now, this is the last part of my presentation. I'm starting with the question again. It's really African culture or Ubuntu a hindrance or a liberation? Now, my answer to this question is the African culture or Ubuntu is not the hindrance. The hindrance is the African man and African woman. Why? Because we have sidelined our culture in order to embrace the culture of other people. We have decided to not practice Ubuntu, but to practice white man's culture. We care about our individual gains and success, and we don't care about community as such. That's where the culture or Ubuntu appears to be ineffective. It's because we have abandoned it. So the hindrance is not the culture. The hindrance here is the African person. You see, it is mostly said that knowledge is power, but I believe that knowledge is not power. Knowledge is a potential power because many people in the world today have the knowledge of what to do, but they die because they don't do what's supposed to be done. For instance, any person who drives learns that it is dangerous for you to drive and text at the same time. But there are many people who are involved in accidents because they were texting. So even though they knew, they had the knowledge, they didn't save their lives because they did not apply that knowledge. A lot of people know what to do in order to lose weight, for example, but many people suffer with obesity. So you can know too much about African culture, about Ubuntu. You can speak about it. You can do all that you want to do, but that is not going to change the condition of Africa. That is not going to liberate us until we begin to practice that culture. And the problem that we have today is not the fault of Ubuntu as a culture. In fact, Ubuntu is a powerful tool. The problem that we have today is that we have abandoned our culture. We have put it aside in order to practice the culture of the Western man in most cases. And this reminds me of the lost key scenario, whereby a person is walking in the dark with the key, holding the keys in his hands. And suddenly he drops the keys in the dark. And then he lifts his eyes in front and sees the lights. Then he goes under the light to search for the key that he dropped in the dark. And he will never find it. And we are in these conditions today as African people because we have seen the lights of European success. On the TV, we see beautiful cities, clean roads, beautiful buildings, beautiful women on the TV, so forth and so on. And we, including our leaders, we have adopted or we have decided to go under the European lights to seek our liberation, to seek our freedom, but forgetting that we are what we are today because we have lost the essence of our humanity in the dark. And we have to go back where we left it to recover it in order to decide what we want to do with our lives. We cannot be liberated by the same culture that created our conditions today. So, in other words, the modern African man today, what we do, we want to fight to win like Europeans in order to live like Africans. So, what I'm trying to say is that we want to use Europeans' methods, which is of the method of individualism, the method of oppression, the method of enslavement of others in order to win so that we can then live after we have won as Africans, which means to live in cooperation, in solidarity, in support, but while we have already preyed on each other. And that cannot happen. When you see what is happening on the continent today, you will see that most African countries have tendency to prey on each other. You see Rwanda waging war against Congo, killing millions of people only for the resources because it wants to win by using European methods or European culture of individualism, exploitation, and extermination. You see the same thing across the continent, not just across the continent, but even individuals. We do the same thing. We want to base our success on the falling of our fellows, on the misfortune of our fellows, on the exploitation of our fellows. We betray each other. We don't want to support each other, right? And then we believe that after we have won with those methods, we can then live as Africans. And that is the problem. So the problem is not Ubuntu, the problem is the African person. So, in this sense, I think Ubuntu is not just for celebration or for the African Day or so forth and so on, but Ubuntu has to be practiced so that it can be able to empower us, to feed ourselves, to educate ourselves, to liberate ourselves from the shackles of neo-colonialism. This is very important. Ubuntu has to be practiced, has to be put in practice so that it can liberate ourselves, right? Ubuntu has to be practiced. It's not just about attire, about language, about beautiful. In fact, I have to remind you about these words by John Henry Clark, who said that black and beautiful is meaningless until it is black and powerful. So, Ubuntu, you can express it in attire, you can express it in celebrations and in music and all these things. It's okay. But unless Ubuntu means black power, it is meaningless. Whether you talk about the language, the names, the dance, the food, the music, it is meaningless until there is the substance, which is the power. All these things are symbols, but a symbol is nothing without its substance, which is the power. So it means Ubuntu must be empowered in order to empower us, right? And for that to happen, all of us as Africans today need to take actions. We need to take actions through Ubuntu so that we can build enterprises, not just individual enterprises, but building those enterprises through collective support. Ubuntu needs to be practiced so that we can be able to start community-run schools, businesses, hospitals, so forth and so on. And we are capable to do that. This language of let's wait for foreign direct investors to come to our country to help us to create a job, it brings us back to the same condition whereby we try to rely on the oppressor's culture in order to liberate us. I mean, that is impossible. The culture that puts you down cannot elevate you. John Henry Clark said it that if people have put you down and have set on you, and you feel like you have a load on your shoulder, the load of imperialism and neo-colonialism, the only way to free yourself is to stand up and to take a position that will make fall those that are sitting on top of you. So we cannot think that these direct foreign investors will come and develop us if really we understand the psychology of capitalism. So it is time that we must begin to put Ubuntu to actions. We must turn Ubuntu into a real weapon of liberation, not just the decorations of activities or of festivities, so forth and so on. Ubuntu must allow us to come together, to pull our resources together, right? To build, whether it's a family business or community business, in all sectors, in industry, technology, AI, so forth and so on. We can do that. It's just a matter of us deciding what to do today. The same energy that we mobilize to go for soccer, the same energy that we mobilize to go to concert, to the music, the same energy that we mobilize for all these things, we can mobilize them to build institutions by using our culture and Ubuntu. Because if I ask a question today, who among us is African can spend 24 hours without having to touch on any item that was made by a foreign culture? Who can do that today? Who can survive without eating the food imported by other culture or produced by other culture? The same food that we can produce in our land, but we have to rely on other people to produce it. who can survive 24 hours without having to use the platforms, the tools produced by other culture? And if there's no one, then that tells me that if today
I
all,
survive. I
all the
survive. I survive more than even a month.
beautiful, thank you, King. Thank you, King. Congratulations, you made it. So,
Thank
but
you.
many of us can't survive, unfortunately. So, which means if all the Europeans or Chinese have to be taken out of this world, we won't be able to survive. You see, that's where I'm going with it. So it is time to put the culture into practice. So the failure is not of Ubuntu. The failure is the African man who has sidelined his own culture in order to use the culture of his oppressor. So I'm going to leave you with these last words by saying that Ubuntu is not just a celebrate. It's not just to celebrate life. It is to liberate life. That is the purpose of Ubuntu. When we practice it in our work, in our schools, in our industries, Ubuntu becomes Africa's key to freedom, right? And finally, I want to say that Ubuntu practiced is a liberation, but Ubuntu ignored is slavery. So, with these few words, I close the lecture of today and I thank you for your attention. And we can open the chat for comments, questions, or anything that you want to say, and you want to add, you want to teach us about this topic. I'm sure I did not cover everything, but I've chosen to touch on the most important items that I thought can make us think and reflect on the impact of our culture on daily lives as African people. Because if we keep our culture only for African Day or only for celebration or only for conferences, then we are making a mistake. The culture has to be has to be embedded in our daily lives, the food that we eat, the things that we do, and we can begin now to begin implementing these things and to put our culture in motion so that this culture can be respected, it can be useful, and we can even teach our kids about them knowing exactly that this is what sustained their lives. So thank you again. Peace and love, freedom and decolonization. I yield my mic and I open the floor for discussion. Thank you so much.